and we'll select our first track, make sure it's on channel 1, it is, and we'll hit record. We'll click on stop here, and sure enough, there's our data there, and we can play that back. Let's select a second track here. We'll set that to MIDI channel 2, and we'll go ahead and click on upper. Let's go back to the start here, and we'll lay in an overdub on our upper part, or using our upper part. Here we go.
Hello, tech support.
How do I record slider movements to an external sequencer?
Now the keyboard is not the only thing on the JP that sends out MIDI messages. In fact, all of the knobs and sliders, except for the volume and tempo knobs, also send out MIDI information. For all of you MIDI dweebs out there, they're actually a combination of continuous controllers and sysx information, and if you're really interested, there's a section in the manual on page 116, I believe, that lists out all of these messages. Anyway, with that ability to send and receive information from the front panel, you can do some really interesting things. Under Shift and 5, our MIDI switches go through until we see Transmit, Receive, Edit switch, and set that to on. Now you'll be able to send and receive MIDI information that's generated by all these knobs and sliders. In fact, let's take that sequence we recorded just a moment ago and record a new track that uses the same MIDI channel we used just a moment ago. We're actually going to overdub some panel adjustments. Here we go, a new track here. It's sending on MIDI channel 2. That's what we want to do, our upper part here. And we'll start at the beginning, and here we go. Go ahead, stop there and check it out. Here are all our front panel adjustments. Let's play it back. Pretty cool, huh? In order to make this happen, make sure that the Transmit, Receive, Edit switch is turned on. You'll also want to make sure that the next screen, Receive Exclusive switch, is on as well. This is because some of these knobs and sliders use continuous controllers and some use system exclusive. If for some reason you must only use continuous controllers, you can hit number 4 here, and MIDI parameters, and set the Transmit, Receive, Edit mode to mode 2. This will assign each knob and slider to a continuous controller. And actually, if you want to get really picky, you can click one more screen here and grab any knob you like and set manually the controller that it uses. Finally, if you want to play those arpeggios from a remote keyboard or even record new RPS patterns, you can send that information down the MIDI control channel. Hit Shift and MIDI parameter until we get to Remote Control Channel. Set this to the sending channel of your remote keyboard that is coming in, and you'll basically replace this keyboard with the remote one. Play arpeggios, record patterns, basically anything you like. Well, that pretty well takes care of the JP8000, but 8000 users, stay tuned because you might be able to pick up some useful editing hints from the next section. So for all you JP8080 users who have got through this first half of the tape, you already know most of what this guy has to offer. You'll just find all of the features that we've talked about before in kind of different places on the front panel. There are, however, a few features on this guy that 8000 users will not find. In fact, let's go over the front panel. Just like the JP8000, we have a button marked Performance patch to toggle between the performances and patches. We now have a slightly different way of selecting them though. We have dedicated bank buttons here. It gives us 8 banks of 8 patches or performances, giving us 64 selections. We can go through groups of these 64 selections by hitting the group down and up buttons. As you can see, we have one group of user performances and 3 groups of preset performances for a total of 256 performances. If you have a smart media card inserted, you'll be able to go even higher. We also have 2 groups, let's go back here, 2 groups of user patches and 6 groups of preset patches for a total of 512 patches. Trust me, that's a lot. We have our panel select, both lower and upper, and our key mode as normal, but there's a new button that we haven't come across before called Preview. Pressing this button will turn these 8x8 selection keys, these white keys here, into a teeny tiny little keyboard. Imagine if you had to practice your scales on these little guys. Now, to get into any of the edit screens, we now have a dedicated edit button that's just to the right of these 8x8 screens. Hit this button and the 8 bank buttons here will flash in preparation for you to go into any one of the 8 edit groups, everything from Performance Common right through to Scope. As in the 8000, we just select any one of them and just keep on pressing until we come to the screen that we need. As you would think, the exit button will get you out of any screen that you're in, and also the shift button is used in conjunction with any button that is marked with a white box such as these.
Hello, tech support.
What's the difference between MIDI in and remote keyboard in?
The back panel is pretty much self-explanatory with the exception of the difference between MIDI in and remote keyboard in. Now, MIDI in, that's a no-brainer. We've all plugged MIDI cables into modules before, and as you'd expect, you plug a MIDI cable into the JP8080 and it will play back those patches and performances that correspond to the MIDI channel or channels that are coming down that MIDI line. And therein lies a problem. Let's imagine we brought up a performance that was a split that had the lower part receiving on MIDI channel 1 and the upper part receiving on MIDI channel 2. Now if we bring up that performance, the keyboard that we have connected this, the MIDI keyboard, is going to have to provide a couple of specialized functions. First up, it's going to need to be able to send out on 2 different MIDI channels, and it's going to have to send them out MIDI channel 1 on the left-hand side, MIDI channel 2 on the right-hand side as well, at that precise split point that has been programmed into this performance. Well, instead of doing all that work, Roland has placed a special MIDI port called Remote Keyboard In that basically takes care of all that confusion. Think of Remote Keyboard In as kind of like placing a keyboard on the front of your JP8080, one that you don't need to worry about whether it's transmitting on the correct MIDI channels for your split and dual modes. Now, if you ever have any problems with not getting the arpeggiator or the RPS up and running, chances are this is the reason. You're probably plugged into MIDI in versus Remote Keyboard In. Now, another thing you'll see on the back here that you won't see in a lot of modules is external input. This is really cool because you can be what you've always wanted to be, your very own oscillator. In fact, you can do all sorts of vocoding with this and a lot of other effects too. You'll notice in the top right hand corner here we have 2 knobs referring to those 2 external inputs in the back panel. You can adjust the levels accordingly. You may use them for stereo inputs or for instrument and vocal ins if you're going to use some of those vocoder-like effects. And if you just want to quickly plug a microphone in, you can plug it in the front here if you like and just press this button next to the jack. If this button is lit, it'll take input from this jack. If not, it'll take it from the back. So now we have external inputs coming in. What can we do with them? Well, the first thing I can think of is that we can use them as our external oscillators. If we were to grab either the lower or the upper panel select, we can go into oscillator 2, and instead of selecting one of these waveforms, we can hit external, and then whatever is coming in those external ends will run through the synthesizer. Basically, all of these knobs and sliders will affect that sound coming in. Basically everything except the pitch controls. Select Performance User 87 and we'll select the upper panel because we're going to be talking into the mic. As you can see, the external input is selected for oscillator 2 here, so let's have some fun with the filter and effects. First, make sure that the front panel is selected. So now I should be hearing my voice through the external oscillator here, and you can hear some effects on there. We can adjust the effects with this guy here. And in fact, let's play with the filter and give ourselves a bit of LFO depth on the filter. We can get crazy here by putting ourselves onto a random here, and we can change the rate. Check, 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 check. That's pretty powerful, especially when you realize you could drop, say, a drum machine's output into this and have an LFO opening and closing, say, the filter. In fact, you could sync that LFO so that you have an automated wah-wah effect.
Hello, tech support.
How do I get that cool vocoder effect on my voice?
The next use of the external input we'll look into is the formant filter. Now, to first get into this, we need to press the voice modulator button. We now have 3 panels to deal with: the lower panel, the upper panel, and voice modulation panel. To change the settings for the lower panel, select lower. For upper panel, select upper. For voice modulation, hold down the shift key and upper to get to the voice modulation panel. Now the two shall flash, and all the knobs and sliders that have a blue ledger here will become operational. Let's do an example by bringing up performance number 86, formant filter, and we'll plug a mic into the front here and activate it by pressing the front button. With this all set up, I can vocode like it's 1999. Now, what the 8080 is doing is splitting up my voice into 12 bands, frequency bands, and splitting up the either lower, upper, or both of these parts in the 8080 into those same bands. By sampling the amplitude of my voice and using that to modulate these bands, it makes the 8080 talk, 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 talk. Let's start one from scratch. Bring up performance P117 dance split. We have a split here with a bass on the left-hand side, that's the lower panel, and a synth on the right-hand side, or the upper panel. Let's add a vocoder effect to the upper part here, the synth, by selecting the upper panel. Let's turn the voice modulator on here. We also want to turn on the front panel button here so that we're gaining input from this front jack here. And let's bring up the volume. Now, directly below the voice modulator button is the voice modulator send. If you press this button, whatever part you're working on, in this case it's our upper panel here, will be modulated by the mic input. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2, check 1, 2, check 1, 2. I can then turn it on or off by hitting the voice modulator send button. That's off, that's back on. And seeing we are in the upper panel, you'll notice that there's no vocoder effect on my left hand. If I did want to have vocoder effect on my left hand, just turn this off on the upper panel and we'll go down to the lower panel and turn it on here. Voila, vocoder effect on my left hand. Now, to fully understand the formant filters and the voice modulation, we should probably initialize. Go into Edit and 7 and scroll through until we get to Vmod Initialize. We can hit decrement until we get all the way back to the beginning. The first 6 are formant filters that range from vintage through to Husky Robot. If you're wondering what the heck Husky Robots have to do with anything, basically anything that starts off or uses the name robot needs no input from the keyboard.